Hello everyone, we're here to talk about Control, some world building and other stuff. Quick warning, quick disclaimer, there will be some spoilers from Control, probably from Alan Wake, and there will be a lot of talking about Jung, horror, and Campbell, about Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey. Probably most of you know that, but to be specific, hero's journey is that model or theory from the book of Campbell that inclines that hero went on a, it's really long story short because it's a long book. Hero went on the journey because reasons, there are always reasons. The journey changes him, and then the changed hero changes the world. Even if you think you don't know that, but you're here on the Digital Dragons, so you probably heard about that theory. But even if you don't know, you do know. You probably, most of you watched Star Wars or something like that, and most of Western culture is based off that. Every famous movie trilogy or most of the TV series use this, so here it is. And we will be talking here about a really specific game that is Control, that has all this mechanism put front side instead of somewhere backside. So here we are. How conscious was the process of creating the Control? Because it seems like really focused on topics, archetypes, psychological themes, and I'm really curious, was it conscious? Like, you know from the very beginning, yes, we're using that theory, that symbol, that archetype, or was it like, we have nice stuff, oh, there is a theory to that. So which way was it, or was it something entirely else?
Right. So that's a great question and a complicated one, and you're like asking, I think, three different questions almost at the same time. So
be prepared for that a
yes.
lot. We have limited time, and there's a lot.
So just to unpack Control a bit, because I think it is a product of its time when you look at Remedy as a studio and where we were when we started to think about that game. We just finished Quantum Break, and Quantum Break to me was like a product of an era and an end of an era as well, in a way, for Remedy. We built the games in a certain way where we thought about all of that stuff really carefully, trying to kind of pinpoint the ways to kind of build the characters and their journey through the experience. And I definitely want to talk about Hero's Journey because I have a few points about that as well. But that was the setup. And there was this kind of a very kind of a top-heavy philosophical approach that we have within the studio. And Quantum Break was a kind of a culmination of that. Okay, so and I'm very proud of Quantum Break, and we achieved the things we wanted to achieve. But there was a feeling as well where when we came out from that it felt quite predictable. Something that felt seen and expected in many different ways. And it was the kind of a perfect cue for something like Control to happen. Because what I wanted to do, and all the people around me in the studio at the time, was to subvert those expectations that we've set up as a studio. So when we look at the hero's journey and the overall setup, we definitely wanted to kind of hold on to these kind of philosophical ideas, but then try to kind of do it in a way where there's a sense of surprise, and these kind of archetypes and symbols, they play a role. And I think it's mostly for us to ensure a degree of relatability. And when you look at the Jungian archetypes, like when we talk about the collective consciousness and all of these type of elements, it is a way to kind of connect things to our reality, something that's familiar to us, yet make it weird and strange and surprising. And that kind of a conflict was what we found interesting. So, and when you look at the hero's journey setup and look at Jesse, for instance, as a character, we definitely wanted to kind of, there was a a call basically to kind of arrive to the oldest house and so on. And there's all these kind of steps that you want to do. There's the refusal of the call and so on, like, is this for me, and so on. There's the mentor, etc. And yes, we have those things, that the mentor is Ahti, like, who is this kind of a really strange character that's way more, of course, than what he seems. And then how he kind of takes that role and how he kind of go through his own journey. I think there's a surprise there as you kind of go through that adventure. And one of the things that I actually like about Jesse, and this was something that was very important to me, that you look at the hero's journey, which is a good template, but then you kind of want to fuck around with that a bit, right? So, for instance, within the first 10 minutes, when Jesse arrives to the oldest house, and it's a weird, scary place, and strange things are happening, but then when she picks up that gun, it almost kills her, and she goes through that trial, right? Like, she's kind of transported this other reality. She doesn't come out from that as scared or, fuck this, I'm gonna kind of leave. She's like, no, this is something I want to embrace. This is something that I want to meet. I'm happy. Like, she literally says that afterwards. And that, to me, is something that was a nice little punch into the hero's journey, kind of a setup, and so on. So we wanted to do these type of things, and do something more unexpected.
And you did, not only on that level, but on the design, how you show the story. And that's my second question, basically. You fit in perfectly. Because in Control, a lot of storytelling is pushed into the environment, into the notes, into recordings. Weren't you afraid of putting that amount of information, pretty necessary informations, into the background, basically?
Yes, that was, I think, one of the probably the biggest cultural shifts that we had to go through. Like, coming out from Quantum Break, there was this very linear storytelling that we had, like heavy cinematics, and like how you got all of your abilities. Everything was scripted and was supposed to happen at a very specific spot and so on. There was no great sense of agency that the player had, and so on. They couldn't take the time to really kind of pay attention to what is this world and find their own path through it. And that's something that we wanted to change with Control. And it sounds easy on paper, but you have to understand that as a studio, we had like 20 years, 15, 20 years of this kind of inbuilt instincts on how to go about doing things. And to me, like, what I wanted to do, and this is my kind of a personal kind of passion as a game director, to push towards creating worlds where the players feel like they are in control. I'm sorry about the pun. But it's not an accident that it's called Control, by the way. So it's in many ways in us wanting to also take control of our own fate as a studio as well. Anyway, it was a big cultural shift. And I think it was almost a year that I had to spend talking with the team a lot about what is the approach, why are we doing it as we're doing it, and like accept things like, what if the player never finds this? What if they never experience these things? What if they don't get it? And it's a kind of a scary question for
Sorry.
Okay.
We'll talk about horrors later.
Yes, we're gonna get to that. But it's like, it's a scary question to a game developer when they think that there's a danger of alienation from the experience of what it is. And my argument was, I think if we put an interesting thing in the world, let them have the agency to discover it by themselves, they are actually way more invested in wanting to understand what it is and to participate in the experience. Usually, and this is what I felt when I looked at Quantum Break, when things are kind of just given to you and you don't really have a say when or are you even interested in it, but you have to take it. I think there's something antithetical almost when you look at what games are supposed to be. So there is that big shift that we had to go through. And maybe the big question was like, can we be Remedy and do that? And my stern belief was, absolutely, yes, we can. All the stories that we are telling are like really iconic, authentic Remedy stories that we're still telling. We're just delivering them in a different type of way, making sure that the players need to participate. And there was like definitely this kind of a period where like, will they get it? Will they see it? And so on. And I was really happy to see that, yes, it clicked. People are excited about it. And looking at the whole setup, sorry, I'm just wrapping this up real soon. The whole setup for the game was even like early on when I started to talk about this with Sam, like who's the lead writer for the game, that I want this whole thing to happen in single location, right? Like we make it really kind of a, in a way, tight but open, right? And we build this first and foremost as a world. And then once we have that set up, then we kind of inject the stories and things into it for the players to discover and so on. So the whole way of doing it was fundamentally different from day one. But yes, there was a period of time where people had to learn to trust it and see it work before they could be like fully invested in it.
Okay, you basically mentioned the next point, because I want to know what is easier to the design, the approach from Control when it's more moving objects, interacting with environment, and letting players play the game, or making the cutscenes heavy game, because you basically have two of these in the same universe. Alan Wake is more classical, and Control is more like these Japanese flicks when you have all of the moving objects and interactivity.
I think they can be both equally tough. I think there's just that you kind of choose what are the risks that you want to take. With Alan Wake and Quantum Break, it was, I use the term top heavy, as in you can't really properly start the development of the game until you have a pretty clear picture of the full kind of a story and all the related elements to it. You have like ideally an outline of all the kind of pieces of the events that you have, and only then you can start to piece it together. And so early on, you need to be kind of gone through that creative journey of saying, yes, this is what we want to build, and then it's a matter of building it. And it sounds simple, but then practice, when you look at Alan Wake, it took us 6 years to get there. And with Quantum Break, it was equally complicated process. Control was interesting that it seems like, well, I'm sure there are opinions on this, but it seems like a big world and big game. Like there's a lot of things that you can discover, but we actually did it in 3 years, and with a quite sensible budget. So I think there is so the risks that you faced was that with Control, we started off with the world first, get the kind of an exciting place to be within. And yes, we had, of course, the ideas for the main character. We wanted her to be a director of the bureau and all of these things. But the actual journey of her, how she kind of, what is the main campaign, if you will, and what are all the side quests and all these things that you can discover, they were built with very different philosophy. It wasn't like one person coming up with all of that stuff and then just giving it to the team. The difference was that we involved the team very early on to kind of build the world and kind of participate in the creation of that. And a huge part of my job was to kind of nurture that environment and of course make sure it's cohesive and kind of fulfills the purposes that we wanted to fulfill. But with that approach, I think we were able to move fast early on and also kind of see what works and what doesn't work, and we could still do like pivots and changes during it. Whereas with the top-heavy model, where you have one single story, and everything is built around that one single story, that puts a lot more pressure on the team, and scoping is a lot harder, pivoting is a lot harder, and so on. So that does create problems. So actually, now that I think this true, I actually feel like Control's model is actually easier, at least to me.
Okay, so but it's still a big game. I mean, there's a huge scope, and so was in Alan Wake. I heard some rumors about the development of the Alan. So I'm wondering, because you're still a rebels like in this industry, like you have this AAA approach, but are games like Control AAA or like some hybrid with indie Rebelos segment?
That's a great question. Looking back at Remedy, I think I've always been excited to be part of Remedy because I feel like there is this creative independence that we have. Going back to Alan Wake, and everybody who's paid attention, Alan Wake's path was really complicated. Like, we pretty much announced it as an open world game in, I think, 2004 and 2005. And quite quickly turned out that wasn't a good idea. Like, let's take a step back and rethink this stuff. So there was a period where we did a massive pivot. But what was, I think, exciting about Alan Wake at the time was that I remember, like, it was a time of like Gears of War and Space Marines and so on. And here's a game where you're a writer, right? Like, whose stories come true, and there's this like a more nuanced, like different perspective that you're not used to kind of experience in games. And sure, there are those. I'm not saying that, but still, it felt to me like fresh and independent and bold. Like, especially during that time period. And what's crazy about Alan Wake and Remedy is like, yeah, we've never been a massive studio. Now it's like starting to be pretty big. But during Alan Wake, I think the dev team was like 35, 40 people. And sure, it peaked a bit at certain points, but that was like the core development team. And I was the lead game designer at the time. And what was kind of bizarre about that situation was that, yeah, I was a lead, but I actually didn't have any game designers under me. It was literally just me. And there were like scripters who kind of work on the levels who I kind of collaborated with, but it was pretty much me and coders looking at all the safe haven systems, like how light worked, all the weapons, the enemy AI, and how we made that. Like, there was a lot of clever solutions that we had to do to make it work. And that allowed us to kind of punch above our weight in a way, that it seems like we're doing a lot, that we're paying a lot of attention to the polish and quality of the game and the visuals. And even though there's not a huge team behind it, it can come across as getting close to like a AAA, if not a AAA experience. But the world, I think, is changing, and I think it's getting a bit more like, is there like Quattro A nowadays? Like, it's just looking at God of War and these type of games, Last of Us. These are like insanely massive and expensive games with the massive team that worked on it. So it's interesting. We talked at Remedy at some point that we're like independent AAA, right? So there's this sense of like, okay, we're not a big studio, but we would like to kind of be able to produce things that kind of gets into that AAA environment, though.
I have different questions for now, but you mentioned something about God of War and all that stuff. It's something that we talked right before we started the interview. Don't you think that games like Control, Elex, Dark Souls, that are more playable and less focused on attractors that force you to play them, like by force, you have to, because cutscenes, because story, because you have to save somebody. Don't you think that games like Control and all the mentioned can survive more in players' consciousness because they allow you to breathe, to take your time, Don't you have that feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of Dark Souls. I played through all of them, and Elden Ring was mind blowing. And there is this core philosophy that you can see that there is this sense of putting the player into a position of facing the hardship and like facing the challenge and then choosing to go at it, choosing to kind of deal with it. And kind of goes back to what I talked about before, that when you make it a player choice, I think they are way more invested in it. And when talking about like cutscenes and like trying to, I don't know, through these passive moments, trying to make them excited and invested, but it's still at the end of the day a moment where you're not doing anything, right? Like it's almost like if there's a long cinematic, you kind of put the controller down and just watch. But can you, as a player, feel engaged by that moment for real? So I think it's a challenging notion to try to sell in a passive way the kind of idea of what the game wants you to do, and instead provoke the player by throwing these challenges at them, but make the players react to the world and then find their own way through it. I think that's just a way more powerful way of doing it, and definitely something that I feel as a director as the right way forward, at least for the things that I want to do. And Remedy is, of course, a complex studio. We're doing a lot of different types of things, and we're going to have different types of experiences. And I think it's a studio that will definitely kind of continue on a more directed experiences as well. But when it comes to Control, that's the path that we're going to have.
Yeah, but Control is definitely the weird, magnificent animal, weirder than any of these other huge games. So I wanted to know what's the role of Control for Remedy and further on for the universe, because we have a lot of questions about shared universe.
Right.
But,
so
for company first, later universe.
Right. So Control, as if you're familiar with Remedy, right? Like you know the things that we've done, and you start playing Control, you quite quickly start to see it as like a collect. Like when you look at the FBC, the Federal Bureau of Control, and see them as this kind of organization that tries to understand this world and often doesn't, but tries to. And it kind of collects these kind of objects of power. Like we give names to things, right? Like when you look back at, like if you played Alan Wake and there was the clicker that Alan used to be able to kind of survive there at the ending and so on. Now we're kind of giving the sense of almost like a scientific, it's not scientific, but this kind of a sense of organization and structure to the world. Like the clicker is an object of power, obviously, right? And when you play Control, like these things are given names and these things exist, and it's not just the clicker, it's not just Alan Wake. Turns out there's a lot of these type of objects across the world and so on. And then we open up the idea of like persons of power, like what Jesse is, and obviously Alan is as well, and Dylan, like Jesse's brother, and so on. So we, in a way, open up the universe of Remedy with Control and connect the dots and so on. And the best way to do it wasn't to tell, again, like a big story like what Alan Wake was, but create a world where you can see this connection to the different stories that we've created. And we've been very, very clever in how to approach that. We have certain IPs and properties that we've sold, but then of course there's like, let's say, a reimagining of similar type of characters without naming any names, of how we managed to kind of create this sense of super collection of Remedy stories within one single world and so on. So it does definitely play a big role as a kind of an opening shot to the idea of a Remedy universe. And I think it's a kind of a smart way forward for a studio like us, because we're not a big, massive studio that can do like too many things at the same time. We need to be very clever, and the more we can make things seem like they belong to something bigger, something more exciting, something beyond just this one experience, I think there's immense sense of value for that, and for the players as well.
So when did it started? When did you started to think about these pieces, these puzzles like Alan Wake, Quantum Break, as a shared universe that led to Control? Or maybe there was another way of thinking about this?
I think there's like, as a kind of a creative leader, you have these thoughts at the back of your head, and they have to percolate for a long while before they come to fruition. And I guess there is this sense of, laying things out early on that, hey, if things kind of click in the future, and you never know the future, you never know how things are going to go with your next game, and maybe it's a massive flop, and then you need to rethink like your whole approach. So it's hard to build like really long-term, goals. But I think there was that kind of a deeper layer within my head, within Sam's head for sure, that we want to be able to connect the dots, but we didn't necessarily have the exact idea of how to do it early on, but we wanted to definitely build something bigger. And it's like, some of the like the last comments, like, or the lines in Alan Wake was like, it's not a lake, it's an ocean, like all of these, and of course at the time it was like nobody knew what the hell that meant, but still it was a statement that we want to go kind of a beyond, like that this thing that you just saw belongs to something bigger. But did we know at that time that we're going to do this thing called Control, 8 years from now? That, wasn't quite that. But I think the seeds existed early on that this is something we want to pursue. And then it was just all about kind of a hoping that the planets would be aligned for that to happen. And Quantum Break was an interesting kind of a detour, I think. And it was a project that was done with very clear sense of purpose, don't get me wrong, but it is a Microsoft IP at the end of the day, compared to Alan Wake and Control that does belong to us. So as said, that's a good example of like maybe what you want to do, and then what is the reality of the environment that you're in, like what is the outlook. Sometimes you need to take a little detour, and then you can get back to what you were doing in the first place.
Okay, but so you at first didn't know the final shape, but you had the seeds, the start intention. We're talking a lot about those two core games for the universe, I believe, Alan Wake and Control. And as a fan, because I really enjoyed both of them, I'm really curious. What's the relationships between those two worlds? I know it's like comparing who's stronger, but there are pretty similar on some levels. Like on a really basic structure, the lake is like those cauldron lake is like those supernatural phenomenon place hub. Alan is gifted, and he has this supernatural advisor, and the same goes for Jessie. She's basically mastering the oldest house. She's facing some supernatural challenges, and she also has that mentor, that Polaris force behind her on her back. So are they equal, or are the relationship different? Because there is a whole bunch of the whole ocean of theories on the internet. You did it for the YouTube.
uh, yes. Yeah, honestly, yes. Like it's so it's I like it, and it falls perfectly in line for what the vision for Control was. Like it's an Control to me is an invitation for people to participate, right? I want them to, like, I want everybody to jump into this world and try to kind of understand what it is. And I like, and we can talk about the horror stuff. I'm personally more excited about things that are more implicit and cerebral than explicit. Like it's not about, like, you know, when we have more tense, unsettling moments in Control, it's not about body horror or jump scares and so on. But I do want people to know the story behind, or well, I want them to find out what is the story behind the things that you're witnessing. And once you start to kind of piece things together in your head, I think through that things become more unsettling and scary. And so that invitation to participate applies to theories of both games as well. Absolutely, I want people to speculate. I want them to create theories of what is happening, and we have our take on it for sure. But again, I don't think we will ever, and I'm sorry, we will never be explicit about any of this stuff, but we're going to be implicit. We want people to dig into it and try to figure it out. And I know that there are like these theories about, like, is Control just a story written by Alan, or is Alan just like a figment of, like, from the perspective of Control? And I don't want to kind of say whether either one is true or false, but I think what I do want to say that both worlds are true. And I leave it at that.
So now you're torturing me for that previous questions, yeah? That's the vengeance. Okay, I will remember that. But you mentioned also terror, horror, because both Alan Wake and Control are pretty specific. As we were talking earlier, I called them soft horrors. I mean, they are dark and pretty scary, but they won't destroy your psyche. They won't make you scared shitless because they're approachable. I mean, so what was for me? It was like the beginning of relationship with horrors, like a therapy to see. Damn, horrors are pretty fine entertainment after all. After all years of avoiding them, but that's only me, my personal experience. But I'm wondering, what was the intent of making them kind of horrors or supernatural thrillers with scary, darker moments, but without the really hard stuff? They are not Silent Hill, for me in a good way, and probably for many of players that have traumas to work with.
That's a great question. So I guess what's important to us is that we trying to find a mature, and I don't mean that in, like, you know, mature rated, but more like mature, and that we are thoughtful and we don't try to be edgy. You know, we want to be something that is more nuanced, and we are not trying to shock people because there's a sense of cheapness to the shock. And I believe more that there's a lasting impression when things are more nuanced and so on. And yes, I do think it's important that it feels like both Alan Wake and in Control as world where there is a threat of violence, and they are brutal world, and Control especially is a brutal world, because you kind of face this reality of that you're dealing with forces that are beyond your comprehension, and if things go bad, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. So there's that. So and again, when I talk about brutality, I talk in more like a psychological terms than physical terms. But there's an interesting difference between Alan Wake and Control, and there is an age rating difference. So we chose to do Alan Wake back in the day as PG-13, and that put actually some real limitations, and it was a strange. I gotta say, like looking back at it today, I'm not sure anymore if it was the right call at the time, but we wanted to.
For me, it was.
Yes, I get that. So, but there is this. You put a little, like, yeah, we wanted to be mature from a like a psychological perspective and tasteful, yet kind of convey that sense of threat and an unsettling world and that threat of violence. But then at the same time, there was a feeling of holding back. Like when you kill the enemies in Alan Wake, there's no blood. They kind of more like just burn away, and there's like this. Everything feels a bit like safer and so on, and that sense of like a physical reality felt a bit more distant in Alan Wake. I believe that even if we would have held on to a mature rating, I still think at the end of the day, we wouldn't have gone like too violent and too much, or like, because with Control, we specifically wanted that to be mature rated because we didn't want to be held back by it. But it didn't mean that, oh, now we're not held back anymore. Let's just go fucking crazy with the body horror and let's have gore like all over the place and blood and jump scares. And you can see that that's not what we wanted to do. But it allowed us to do certain things at certain situations in a way that allowed there to be impact that was valuable for that moment. So I think that's the way to go. And yeah, when we talk about soft horror, I think that's a good term actually. I don't know if I've ever heard that before. Did you come up with that, or?
I'm not sure, but I never heard it in any press or something like that as well. So you can freely use it from now.
Oh, cool! Thank you. But it's a good term because we did actively speak at Remedy that we're not doing a horror game. Control is not a horror game.
But it was unsettling at times with that hiss and all the sensual vibes I get from some lonely wandering through the oldest house.
Absolutely, like yeah. So it definitely needed to be unsettling, and it's a personal thing as well. Horror is interesting. Like I think there's a lot of horror out there that I'm not personally that excited about. Like I don't necessarily care about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because it's gory and violent, yes, but I don't personally get impacted by that. But when you look at horror, like the movie Witch, or Midsummer, or Hereditary, and so on, those are more. And yes, they can be violent for sure as well, but still, it feels a bit more. There's a psychological, there's a character side to it, and the build up, and there's a lot of like care and craft that's been put into the world, and so on. It's not about the shock at the end of the day. It is the environment and to kind of create unique and interesting character journeys of what they're doing something surprising and unexpected. And I gotta say, like nowadays when I kind of check out movies and so on, I tend to steer towards horror because I feel like all the interesting stuff is happening there. And looking at the there's a time when you like a simple action movie, but honestly, that I'm not that excited about that stuff. Maybe it's getting older, like me getting older as well, and something like that. But yeah, no, like I'm drawn to horror, and I gotta say, like I'm not a huge fan of like this big jump scare, like gore-oriented horror things either, and so on. So it's all good.
So we can a little mess the plan and talk about horror influences, because when I was playing, especially Alan Wake, but Control as well. I felt that inspiration, maybe not intentionally, but sawing what I saw, I believe it was pretty intentional. I felt that vibe of old, not necessarily scary, but moody horrors like Carpenter or like X-Files. Supernatural, but Supernatural was actually sometimes scary. Uh, what was your inspirations for those games, those two games? Did I hit or miss with those picks? Oh, and Twin Peaks, of course, the Twin Peaks.
Yes, and I was about to mention Stephen King as well, who was obviously a huge influence for Alan Wake. There's an interesting difference from a genre perspective when you look at Control and Alan Wake. Alan Wake was like the idea was that there's a writer whose stories become true, and he tends to write books that are akin to Stephen King. So it was this interesting collection of these kind of urban legends, right, like an axe murderer and so on. And there's definitely that Twin Peaks side to the kind of a town of Bright Falls and so on, with peculiar, iconic characters and so on. And I think that's pretty much what we love to do at Remedy nowadays anyway. So that Twin Peaks influence, I think, is something that is kind of almost foundational to us. But looking from a horror perspective, it was this kind of almost like homage to classic Stephen King novels and so on. And it was something that is, and we're looking at it as like a relatable thing that anybody can kind of understand and see it, and in a way predictable as well. And we hope that the town of Bright Falls brings in the unique aspect of, what we do at Remedy and with the Coral Lake and so on. So there's strangeness there as well. But now when we look at Control, we had a different influence. It wasn't Stephen King anymore. It was New Weird, which is this literary genre where the whole setup embraces this kind of a strangeness, right? The world is strange and unexpected, and not just the world itself and the events within it, but also the characters themselves. Like if you, both me and Sam were influenced by the book called Annihilation, written by Jeff Vandermeer, and it's an interesting book where there is and these characters don't even have names. There's just biologists, and they go and kind of explore this Area X, which is like a strange place somewhere near Florida or something like that. And it's weird because like the whole world, like what does the world even feel like that there's a strange phenomenon happening in Florida? And they don't really talk about it. And it's like that kind of a strange environment and everybody kind of behaves in a strange way as well. So there's this kind of fundamental big like sense of like that you see familiar things, but there's a lack of familiarity in the behaviors of the characters and so on. Another example, and it's one of like movies that I absolutely love, called Stalker by Tarkovsky, and it has similar kind of themes and so on. And what's captivating about that stuff is that there is that same sense of mystery that I think in a way is, I wouldn't say it's missing from Alan Wake. There's mystery in Alan Wake, don't get me wrong, but there's a more like strangeness to it that invites you to kind of dig into it and want to find out. And that was like really important for Control. And it's not like New Weird isn't specifically like a horror genre, but there can be a sense of dread, I think, in that world, but it's more like the implicit pressure of how you think the world works. Like one of my favorite things, sorry, I'm kind of just steamrolling forward. So in Stalker, there was this like thing where they go through the strange area and they don't understand. There's a scout with them who kind of knows how to go through it. And there's like little nuts that you use to, like these metallic pieces and a piece of thread. And he kind of just throws it ahead from time to time in this forest, and just to see what happens. And it's never explained why he does it, but it somehow dictates, the way they should go through the forest. They never really talk about it, and it's just left to your imagination. And what you're really, of course, asking inside is that, what would happen if they would walk the wrong path? So it's a scary thought because you don't understand what it is. And that's way more impactful. If we would just see somebody walk into a landmine and blow up, it's like it doesn't live, it's something expected. But here there's an embedded mystery, and that's what we wanted to do in Control.
So you basically fell right into my trap. Relax, everything that's on the other side is pretty fun. I promise. It's not that war about these difficult questions. Listen, because you talk about mystery and about your influences, but most of what I recognize from that list still has the surface. And when I played the Control, and probably most of you on the who played that had this feeling that you're playing the game without surface, without narrative surface. It's like experiencing the pure model of the story. Like you don't deal with shaped archetype of, I don't know, wizard or something. If you have to meet the wizard in the game, it's basically the model, like the basis of this game. If you are searching for the archetypal weapon, like Excalibur, you have just the base model, like from the base blocks, like this gun of Jesse is for me some sort of Excalibur that you picked in the early game, and even that is shaped in a really basic way. How hard was to work to create the environment and story around that? Because it's pretty unusual. You don't do that, and you committed that crime. Why? I mean, I know why, but I had to ask that question.
It's a complicated question.
Sorry. Okay, that was a trap.
Yes. So there is that. I think what's the charm, I think, in Control is that there is that sense of mundanity, if that's a familiar word. Like there's this kind of a expression of a world that looks very expected in a way, right? Like you see things that seem harmless, like the red telephone or, any of these type of other objects of power, that they look perfectly normal in many different ways. And that's the kind of base starting point in creating that sense of mystery. If there would be a lot of like, let's say, like weird, miraculous things and VFX and things are glowing and it feels like a world where unicorns can kind of step into view at any given time, I think it loses a sense of like relatability and a kind of a grounded feel, I think. And that kind of a bare bones approach, things are what they are and they look like this, but then there's this kind of a mysterious inherent strangeness to what can happen if you deal with these things in the wrong way. And it's like, to be able to enter the oldest house, you shouldn't bring in anything that is out of bounds when we look at the collective consciousness. Like if it's a new gadget that nobody has heard about, don't bring it in, but it's never said out loud like, well, what will happen if you do? And so we take the idea of familiar things and then say, but be careful with that. And suddenly things are not mundane anymore, even if they look like that. And I think that kind of a layering of a threat, yet familiarity and almost like a boring mundanity of them is what makes it powerful at the end of the day.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to finish on the cliffhanger, just like you did to me with Alan Wake, and to all of us. So thank you for all the interview and all the answers. They were fulfilling, and I hope they told something for you all. And really, really thank you. It was Mikael Kasurinen.
Thank you.